Hello everyone, yes, this title is not clickbait. Today we're talking about the one power that I actually think will surpass Sukuna, and just this power going explained in general, which is the power of binding vows. And before we get into this video, be sure to like and subscribe if you like anime content like this, and let's get into binding vows explained. Now with this video, I'm going to cover actually a lot more than just binding vows. I'm also going to cover incantations, hand signs, and heavenly restriction all in this video, albeit I'm going to be very brief of heavenly restriction, purely because I think all of these fall under some type of binding vow, and I think they should all be discussed nonetheless. Now, before we can describe what the types of binding vows are, I'm going to give a definition of what binding vows are extremely briefly. Binding vows themselves are the ability to make your curse technique stronger, have less curse energy consumption, etc., all based on things that are sacrificed and lost in exchange. However, it's not just limited to curse technique. This can also go to your curse energy as well as even your own physical stats, at least when it comes to binding vows casted on one person and not between two people, which I am going to get into a bit later into the video. First, I want to talk about incantations and hand signs. Incantations and hand signs allow you to transform your technique and whatever technique you're about to perform into that of a ritual in order to make it much stronger and have a much grander impact, as well as make it more durable in the process. This was mainly used by Gojo, Satoru, and Sukuna recently, but it is mainly for Gojo who uses it. Where Gojo used it on both the hollow purple nuke he used at the end of their fight, as well as the hollow purple he used at the start of this fight. However, there is something extremely interesting that Sukuna notes in chapter 234. The purple fired at the beginning of the fight had more than 120% output. He likely used some sort of binding vow, which means incantations and hand signs are only able to give it a max of a 120% output buff, similar to the buff that you get after utilizing the Black Flash. Of course, Sukuna is an incredibly viable source for this because of his abilities in his true form, with his true form being called Perfection because of its abilities to cast constant incantations while also doing hand signs while continuing to fight, which is the normal loss for being able to use incantations and hand signs, which is the fact that you're not able to use your mouth and your hands and you lose capability of using both of those in a fight until the ritual is over. However, due to Sukuna's Heian era form having a stomach mouth and having 2 extra arms, this is not a drawback for Sukuna. Basically putting it so all of Sukuna's Heian era attacks are going to be at extra 120% output. However, there are ways to go even further than the 120% output, which is now where I'm going to get into binding vows themselves, and every single binding vow that we have actually seen in Jujutsu Kaisen. Now, the first binding vow we need to talk about is the entire technique reveal binding vow, purely because this is the first binding vow we were ever introduced to and one of the most prominent ones within Jujutsu Kaisen, where by revealing your curse technique to an opponent, you're able to make your curse technique either more potent or take up less curse energy than it would normally use. For example, when Nanami first used it fighting against a transfigured human, he was able to make his strikes much more powerful in comparison to before, as well as Todo, who when he used it against Nanami was able to make clapping take less curse energy than before. Of course, we don't actually know how much curse energy of an amp it was or how little curse energy took in comparison. We just know that it does make a noticeable difference in comparison to before. Another binding vow that we are introduced to early on is from Nanami Kento, where Nanami's binding vow allows him to limit his curse energy to access about 80 to 90% while he's on the clock working for Jujutsu High. However, if he has to work overtime, he ends up being able to access a total of 110% of his cursed energy as a result, heavily amplifying his power even more. Furthermore, if he wants, he can break the binding vow. However, this will only give him access to 100% of his cursed energy and not 120%. The next binding vow that we are introduced to is the one that is evolved with Bird Strike, where in exchange for the creature's life, they are able to massively amplify its curse energy output for 1 strike, allowing a bird, a crow that usually has low amounts of cursed energy, to one-shot a special grade curse being the Cursed Spirit Smallpox Deity, which might have been amped by Kenjaku even further to make it even more powerful. Furthermore, Meme says no one has ever survived this attack other than Satoru Gojo, which we don't know how impressive that is, but it's still strong enough to near one-shot a special grade curse to begin with in exchange for a crow's life. The next binding vow that we are introduced to that's confirmed to be a binding vow is Sukuna's binding vow that he has placed on his domain, where he is able to vastly increase the area itself by making it a possible escape route inside of his domain, making it so the domain itself has a max range of 200 meters. The next binding vow that we know about is Hakari's binding vow to sacrifice his left arm in order to survive Kashimo's water explosion, which the way this works is by transferring all of the curse energy that would normally be in his left arm, thus sacrificing his left arm and increasing it even further, he was able to protect his entire body. Now, a lot of people did originally think his left arm was just permanently gone, but I think the binding vow itself was, if he were to lose his left arm and Kashima was still able to fight, in exchange for that, he would be put in a much weaker and less able to fight position because Hikari would no longer be able to cast his domain, which is why it had such a strong effect. These are all of the confirmed solo act binding vows, which is a binding vow that you make with yourself. However, there are still other binding vows, such as binding vows between other people, but before we get into binding vows made by other people and what each of those have done, I do want to talk more so about the binding vows known as Heavenly Restriction. Heavenly Restriction is a type of binding vow that is placed on a person at birth. And while most people do believe Heavenly Restriction is something that can only happen randomly, it is heavily implied one of the two Heavenly Restrictions that we can talk about was actually done as an experiment at birth, which is the one on Kokichi Muda, otherwise known as Mekamaru, where in exchange for having an extremely weak physical body, through his Heavenly Restriction, Mekamaru was able to massively increase the distance and range that his puppets could go through, having them go all across Japan, as well as giving them a massive cursed energy buff in the process as well, in exchange for having an extremely weak body to the point where sunlight hurts his actual body and he needs to live his entire body and life inside of a bathtub until Mahito was able to heal his Heavenly Restriction body. However, it seems like the power and benefits that gained from the Heavenly Restriction were not removed, even though Mahito did actually heal his body. Furthermore, another Heavenly Restriction that we do know about is the one belonging to Toji and Maki Zenin, where they are born with absolutely zero cursed energy, and in the process they get several buffs, such as being at peak physical human levels of actual strength, as well as being completely undetectable by domain barriers, allowing sure hits not to be able to hit them and for them to be basically treated as objects. Finally, their senses are also heavily enhanced in the process as well, and you can't sense them using cursed energy. The way someone with Heavenly Restriction is able to sense things like Cursed Spirit is rather sensing the air around the Cursed Spirit and the fluctuations of the air around the Cursed Spirit itself. Furthermore, they're also able to bend their bodies in completely unnatural ways as well, basically putting them at like these peak human levels of what a human could physically be capable of achieving. Oh, and finally, they're able to air hop as well. And now we're going to get into the final type of binding vows, which is binding vows between two people. However, I'm not going to go over every single example for that purely because of the fact, like, most of the time the binding vows between two people are used for the same purpose, other than one specific time, which I'm going to get into a bit later. Binding vows between two people are usually used in order to make a mutually assuring deal between two people in order to make sure both parties go towards the deal and follow through with the terms and conditions of the deal. With the result being, if either two parties do break the deal, it is going to set up a massive punishment for the party member who does break the deal as a result. A punishment so bad that Sukuna himself doesn't want the punishment. Now, we do not know what the punishment is currently in current day, however, we do know Kenjaku has escaped the punishment before via hopping bodies, which means binding vows between two people are linked only to that of the body itself and not the sorcerer themselves, if you have a way to hop souls. However, I do think it's very, very specifically limited to Kenjaku's curse technique and not curse objects that are able to hop souls, or else if Sukuna knew this, he wouldn't be afraid of breaking a binding vow because he'd just be able to do it to himself, and Kenjaku's specific curse technique allows him to do it differently and not have to suffer the consequences. So basically, because Kenjaku's curse technique is specifically switching bodies, he is able to bypass the consequence of breaking a binding vow deal. However, other people who return to cursed objects and reincarnated through that, or able to swap bodies through non-curse technique methods, like how Sukuna turns himself into a finger, is not able to escape the punishment of a binding vow in the process. Through mutual binding vows, you're also able to put subconscious commands into people and parts of the deal that they will not forget. After all, Sukuna's part of the deal that he made with Yuji was, in exchange for healing Yuji, Sukuna would get 1 minute of control over his body where he would not be allowed to hurt or kill anybody. However, in the process, Yuji would forget this part of the deal and would have no idea that that was part of the binding vows, that Sukuna could take control over Yuji's body after casting the word in chain. Furthermore, binding vows are a lot more based on your thoughts and what you're including in the deal as you're thinking, rather than a solid definition of a word. For example, when Sukuna used the binding vow on Yuji's body in specific, he was able to injure Yuji's body, even though the specific limitation of the binding vow was that he was not allowed to hurt anyone. However, when Yuji was thinking about everybody, he was not thinking about himself. Thus, Sukuna was able to bypass it because it was a hole in the deal itself. The deal seems to be based a lot more on how the characters interpret words rather than how the actual word is defined. So, because Yuji only had everyone else in mind for people that Sukuna couldn't hurt and didn't think about himself, Sukuna was able to bypass the deal via hurting Yuji instead, and it didn't trigger the conditions of the binding vow because Yuji didn't consider himself as anyone. Furthermore, another binding vow that was worked around was the one Mekamaru made with Kenjaku and Mahito, where Mekamaru would give Kenjaku and Mahito information in exchange for his physical body being repaired. However, Mekamaru was able to create backup plans and backup drones because they didn't immediately get in the way and they didn't bypass the deal of helping Jujutsu High until after the deal was already complete and Mekamaru was already dead. And because he was still cooperating with them and didn't create backup plans that didn't activate yet, they were able to bypass the binding vows. So basically, in order to bypass a binding vow, you actually need to know what a character themselves were thinking at the time and find holes in their thinking, rather than finding holes in the words themselves. Which, I'm going to be honest, is a really interesting way of interpreting this entire binding vow concept that I don't actually see being taken that often in many forms of fiction. The final form of binding vow that we actually see is from Meimei and Uiui, where Uiui has his cursed energy suppressed until Meimei gives the command, allowing Uiui to release a massive amount of his cursed energy, which was used against the smallpox deity, so the smallpox deity targeted Uiui instead. However, that's about everything that we know about binding vows and every single binding vow that was used in the series so far. And I want to see what you guys' thoughts are in the comment section down below. Maybe I missed something, who knows? And I'm gonna see y'all later. Peace out, have a great day.